you don't want to be recorded in any fashion, this is the time to leave us, but hope you stay. I'm recording now. Robin, you can go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome, League members, and welcome guests. The League of Northern Arizona is very honored today to have two multiple award-winning journalists, Rob Odell and Nick Penzenstadler. They're going to speak about their two-year investigation into how special interest groups are achieving their policy objectives by writing copycat legislation and getting it passed in state houses nationwide. Their investigation involved over 30 reporters and a massive number of computers. Their reporting won the prestigious Goldsmith Prize awarded by the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University in 2020. I want to thank them very much for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Now, a little bit more about Rob and Nick. Rob is a senior investigative and data reporter at the Arizona Republic. He has twice been a finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award, most recently in 2020, for a series showing how unregulated groundwater pumping is drying up rural Arizona's water supply. He's responsible for running Arizona Republic's 4-person data team, assisting the other 3 reporters to plan, develop, report, and write enterprise and investigative stories. Rob has been named Arizona Journalist of the Year by the Associated Press 5 times, most recently in 2020. And he's joining us from the Phoenix area. Next is Nick Penzenstadler, who's coming to us today from Milwaukee. Nick is a member of USA Today's investigative team that works with a network of reporters around the country. His team specializes in data analysis and project management for collaborations across community newsrooms within Gannett. His work, along with a team of USA Today reporters analyzing interstate teacher discipline and licensure, was a finalist for the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting and was also awarded the Educated Writers Association's data citation. After Rob and Nick speak, we'll take your questions. And as Marianne mentioned, please feel free to post your questions at any time in the chat box. And now I'd like to turn it over to Nick. Nick, welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. I am going to share our presentation, and we have a couple videos along the way. And I'm going to get our audio. Okay, so it looks like we're going. Okay, so I'll go over some of the top-level national stuff that we found. And as mentioned, this is a really big team. I played a really small part. Rob is really the expert on some of the guts of the data analysis of this, as well as he's an expert on the Arizona side that probably is way more interesting to you guys. But I'll go over some of the top level stuff. We looked at 10,000 pieces of legislation over 8 years, and we looked at both bills that were introduced and ones that were finally put into law. So there are 2,100 of these that were actually signed into law that we identified were matching our criteria for being a model bill. So 1 million bills floating, 10,000 introduced that matched that way, and 2,100 that were signed into law that hit that requirement. And how we did that was introducing known models, so organizations that post them or circulate them within their groups of what they want for legislation, word for word, and then tried to pair that with that big universe of all that text. And then we use computers to try to identify strings and then give them a score of how strongly they matched up. So likely matches down to not so likely, but similar matches. And then once we did that, the hard work began of doing the reporting, identifying the groups, contacting the legislatures, getting reaction, and that's what the stories came out with. A few of the key findings along the way, we saw this trend of deceptively titled bills, things like the HOPE Act, which you might be familiar with, the Asbestos Transparency Act. A lot of these were focus grouped and tested with audiences and voters, and more importantly, legislators, to make them sound like it's an easy thing to vote for. Everyone's for transparency, everyone's for hope. But obviously those don't always match what's in the bill. Many times they gave the illusion of expert endorsement, where you maybe had one expert who was the niche, most knowledgeable person in the country who was in favor of this specific bill, but didn't necessarily mean they knew or had the consensus of like the scientific community. The same went for this illusion of grassroots support. We often found presentations being made at these bill introductions and at hearings that suggested this really natural groundswell of support, and there's a need for this, many people support it, let's write a bill about it, when in reality it was more of that astroturf, fake support, not a big group of people who are calling for something to be made into law. We often found these bills overruled the will of the voters or the popular opinion. So there'd be, wide support for marijuana legislation, and then groups would write specific bills against a very small part of marijuana legislation. So that's where the special interests with a knack for model legislation can overcome the will of the people. We did some breakdowns trying to categorize who was introducing these bills, and far and away the most frequent group is niche industry, business, commerce groups that had a specific reason, whether it's pushing down the number of lawsuits, lowering the barriers to entry for business, making employment easier. Those are the groups that were really pushing these, as opposed to maybe the social groups or explicit Republican liberal groups. It was really the industry that pushed the most of them. And as I talked about earlier, a lot of times these bills were really obscure solutions, and many times were aimed at sending messages versus actually solving problems, where it's kind of a stretch to identify what specifically is this bill trying to accomplish, if not for just sending a message. We want to give you a look at, this is the story you can find, and I'm sure they'll have links to this as it was presented online. Pretty nice visualization. We partnered with our USA Today team, the team at the Arizona Republic, as well as the Center for Public Integrity, who had been doing a similar effort, and we kind of combined efforts with them to use the best of our abilities. Okay, we're gonna show one of our videos, and this is really the crux of how this works. So here we go.
Your state representative. It might be the state Senate, House, Assembly, whatever you call it. The representatives are supposed to represent you. They write the bills, they debate bills, they vote on the bills for you. Now, let's be real. We all know there are special interests too. Big donors, powerful companies, unions. Lots of groups want to say about what bills get passed. You probably knew that. But what you might not know is how they have a say in what bills even get written. You see, lawmakers often don't really write the bills they sponsor. Somebody else does. Who? One system for that is called model legislation. It's sort of a fill-in-the-blanks way to create a new law. USA Today compared the text of 2,000 model bills against every bill introduced in every state from 2010 to 2018, looking for when the models had been copied. We ran them for months on the equivalent of more than 100 computers. They compared hundreds of thousands of bills against each other to find when text from one had been copied to another. It turns out it's happening in every state. We found more than 10,000 bills were almost entirely copied from model legislation. More than 2,000 of these bills became laws. These dealt with controversial topics like school choice, abortion, and gun control, and everyday services like teeth whitening and hair braiding. Bills get pre-written by a special interest group. They identify a problem, they write the solution. Then someone persuades a lawmaker to introduce the bill as if it were an original idea. But it's not. That's why people call it model legislation. Someone creates a model. Everybody else copies it. Both sides do it. The top states for conservative model bills were Mississippi, Arizona, Oklahoma, Missouri, and West Virginia. For liberals, the worst offenders were New York, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Illinois, and New Jersey. Industry successfully peddled more than 4,000 model bills, including bills that limit your ability to sue asbestos companies. At last, we can see when your lawmakers are pushing someone else's fill-in-the-blank idea. Because, remember, they're your state representatives. They're supposed to represent you.
Okay. So here's a pretty good breakdown of what I was talking about earlier. Is this left side is introduced and the right side is adopted, and you'll see, industry groups still represent that huge majority of who's writing a lot of this model legislation. This is interesting, kind of, we talked about Arizona standing out for its model legislation, but it also stands out. This x-axis here is just the number of raw bills introduced. Arizona and Illinois, way more introductions than many other states. But then the higher you are in this scale is the higher representation of model bills. Some pretty familiar breakdowns on conservative and liberal states where you saw more introductions, more passages of model laws, kind of based on the politics of that state. And I'll pass over to Rob to chat about some of this stuff.
Hi. So we want to look at why is Arizona such a hot spot? Because it clearly is. We did a lot of the reporting and analysis. We didn't know from the beginning. We sort of knew that Arizona had model bills, but when we started out, we didn't understand that Arizona was one of the key states where models are passed. And there's several reasons why it's a hot spot. It has a long time Republican majority. So you see more of these model bills in states where there's a long time majority, Republican or Democrat. And you see more models, like Illinois has a lot of models more focused towards Democrat. Republicans, have ruled the roost at the legislature, for decades, and that's one of the main reasons. There are a lot of safe seats, so politicians generally are more worried about getting primaried than they are running in the general election. So they sort of go to these more conservative models because they want to ward off challenges from the right, rather than being more scared that they could lose a general election. So when you have these safe seats, you see more models. We're home to the Goldwater Institute. And Goldwater told us explicitly they run models in Arizona seeking to export them later. So you have another group that uses Arizona as sort of its training ground for its models. So that's another factor. And we have strong ties to ALEC, both our politicians and staff members. And staff member connections is sometimes, it might sound weird, but it sometimes is even more crucial to the proliferation of model bills, because those staff members don't leave. The staff members at the state who are writing the bills and have connections to ALEC, a new member might come in, but those staff are the same. And we found that was a sort of a powerful predictor of where we see more models. Who's sponsored the most in Arizona? So keep in mind that this is a list from 2010 to 2018, and not everybody was in the was in the legislature during that period, or they might have only been at certain times. So we have Democrats as well. I mean, that's one of the things that we sort of make the point a lot in the stories. This is not just a Republican phenomenon. Democrats do it too. It's just that Republicans are much more successful. So a lot of these model bills that are supported by Democrats in the Arizona legislature, they end up not going anywhere because the Democrats don't have control. And then you see, some of the big legislators that you're probably familiar with, John Kavanaugh, Karen Fan, Sylvia Allen, Nancy Bardo, who run them from the Republican side. And you can see Don Shooter and Debbie Lesko, who's now a congressman, are on this list too. So it is everybody, and it's both Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans are much more successful and they have a lot more bills in Arizona. So I want to go through some famous examples of model bills in Arizona. Right to try. This is the most successful model in history. It's gone through 41 states. It's passed by 41 states, passed by Congress, signed by Trump. For us out here, if you remember Prop 303 in 2014, that was the right to try. And the right to try is basically if you're terminally ill, you can try experimental like cures, treatments to try to cure your disease. The one thing with it though is there already was a way to do that before. That was almost always granted. So it was kind of one of these things like Nick had talked about a solution, finding a problem. This was sort of the same thing. We talked to a number of experts who said, you can't really show much impact where people, couldn't get access to this treatment and now could because of right to try. And we asked Goldwater for people and they ended up giving us 2 people. They sort of fell into what we were talking about, but they also had some questions about it too. So it had limited impact, but was hugely promotional. Everybody talked about it. If you saw Trump's speech where he signed it, he said it was going to help save millions of people. It was written by a for-profit corporation, Cancer Treatment Centers of America. Their lobbyists came up with it. Like Nick talked about, they ran it by groups. They group tested it, focus grouped it, so they could come up with something that they could sell. And there wasn't this groundswell of patients, even though, there are examples of patients, of course, and they promoted the heck out of them, but there wasn't a groundswell of patients that were calling for this. And some experts who we talked to said that they thought it was a way to sort of punish the FDA for laws or rulings that, the drug companies didn't like. So this one is very timely. School vouchers, the ESA program where you can use public money to go to private school. It was passed in 2011 as a program only for disabled students. So basically it was brought to the legislature and said, we need this because disabled kids, autistic kids are not getting the treatment that they need in public school. And so they're going to take that money and get a better education in private school. And it passed by large margins because, of that sympathetic, group it was trying to help. But really what this ended up doing was sort of being the camel's nose under the tent. The bill was written by special interests, Goldwater, ALEC, Americans for Prosperity, which is the Koch brothers network, American Federation for Children. It's very similar to models developed by ALEC and others. We wrote our own bill. So, Arizona wrote its own bill. So in our algorithm, it didn't flag as like copied 90%, but the ideas were almost exactly the same. And then once they got this passed, it's been expanded numerous times. So they added on military families, kids on Indian reservations, kids in failing schools, several others. And then the legislature passed a universal voucher. So any public school student in the state could use it. That was referred to the ballot by a group that's listed here called Save Our Schools Arizona. That was Prop 305 in 2018. Prop 305 was defeated, voters said they didn't want vouchers. But interestingly enough, every year since then, it's come back to the legislature and it's back again now. Actually, after I get off this call, I'm going to watch a hearing at the legislature where they're talking about expanding vouchers for low-income students. That's what it's purported to be. but the sort of the issue with it is it classifies like about 70% of the kids in the state as who could use this voucher. So, you know, obviously people think it's an end run around the will of the voters. And one of the other things like Nick touched on, often these models are used to thwart the will of the voters. We found that in Arizona and elsewhere. So here's a video that Nick's going to put on that ran as part of our project with a mother who was affected by the original 2011 law.
All we are was the way to crack open the door for the rest of them to get the private. They would just assume all the rest of us just go away. There's 4 kids in this household. Okay, we have one that goes to, he's 17. He goes to a public high school. The next 2, who are 15 and 13, they are both diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And the last one is, he's 12 and he goes to a charter school. Expansion really is, Braden. It's like you guys are all like the short people at the back of a concert hall, and what's playing on the stage is an appropriate education, okay? And so what happens is you guys can't see the stage because you're the short people, so you all stand on your chairs, right? Those chairs are actually what ESA is. It allows you to see the concert at the same eye level, the same footing as all of your typical peers, right? But what the expansion is everybody else then steps up on their chair too, and now you can't see. They always back those expansion programs up. They always started out with, you know, video or pictures of our children that are, you know, the drooling, screeching, lurching kids, you know, which everybody has great sympathy for, you know, when you see it on TV. But they don't actually show all of the, they don't show the wealth that's behind the people that are actually seeking this private religious education that goes on. If they meant to give us priority, they would have put it in writing that we were to be given priority. And they don't do that. They don't give it for kids with disabilities. They don't give it for the foster kids. They don't give it for the military kids. They don't give it for the kids in the failing school system. It's not written in there. And now they're proposing the same basic legislation. And do you think they fixed that? Oh no, they didn't fix that. It confirms the fact that they have no intention of giving us priority. But at the end of the day, all we are is a means to a different end. You know, they aren't, when you look at the wording and the way that they phrase it, it's all about us in the beginning, and in the end, we are like dropped like a hot potato.
So, like I said, that was a mother who had 2 special interest children, who, you know, was affected by the 2011 law and her criticisms of the expansion programs that came afterwards. So, I mean, one of the other things that that these bills do is the legislature often preempts city ordinances with models as well. The plastic bag ordinance, there was a number of communities in Arizona that passed rules on plastic bag recycling. The industry went to the legislature and got the legislature to preempt any of those plastic bag rules. In Tucson, they had a practice of destroying guns that were used in crime. So any crime, they would destroy it. The legislature passed a bill that prevented them from doing that. Also another model. in the case of Airbnb, a lot of communities, especially several in Northern Arizona, said we want to put restrictions on Airbnb and Airbnb type units. And the legislature again preempted those cities and said you can't put any restrictions. And the preemption was a model bill that was written by Airbnb that they then used across the country. And so just a little bit about how we did it. One note I wanted to make. So people are like, well, you found 10,000 bills. Why didn't you find more? And so if somebody didn't copy the language directly, it didn't show up in our algorithm. So if you copied the idea, but you wrote the whole bill yourself, it's going to get, it'll get a similar score, but it won't be a high score and it won't be considered model legislation. So we compared 1 million bills between, I actually got this wrong, it's 2010 and 2018. And how we compared it was we loaded in about 2,100 model legislation that we found on the internet. Some people post them. And then just by investigating and, figuring out different groups that do this, can we get an insider who can give us the models, finding them any way we can. And then we ran them against each other. And we, so that is just a massive data lift. It took the equivalent of about 150 computers called virtual machines running for months on end. So one of the ways we did it was we keyworded the bills. So, abortion bills would obviously have keywords like abortion and fetus, guns have different ones. Everyone has different ones. And then we matched those bills that had the same keywords. And then we searched for strings of text, with at least 6 words. So to be considered, you had to have keywords that were the same, and then have at least one string that was 6 words long. We used what's called stemmed words, which is we converted the words to their root. So like walk, walked, walking, walks would all show up the same. And that's a way to sort of get around, that to more easily match. And we scored them based on the lengths of the text strings. So like by the longest text string link, by how many strings of 10 or more words, and how many strings of 20 or more words. So this is a great example. So this is a bill about Sharia law, banning Sharia law, which if you talk to experts under the US Constitution, it is banned, but it sort of has been a way to drum up anti-Muslim support. It's been pushed by conservatives around the country. And so this is just an example of, here's the model, and then there's the Kansas bill and an Idaho bill that are essentially using the same exact language. And that's what we looked for. We looked for stuff that's blatantly copied. And the way we did it was figuring out how many strings of text were exactly the same. I think Nick was gonna jump in here in a bit.
Yeah, this kind of represents the part. I mean, I worked a little bit with some colleagues on calling some of these legislators and saying, hey, our program found this, did you write this bill that is word for word for these other bills? And we got really interesting responses all over the place. This guy on the right is Thomas Mert. He's the #1 bill author in our data, but obviously he didn't write all those bills. So he reacted with surprise. He was surprised to learn that he was kind of identified by our piece as the #1 copycat. And I think his response was genuine, is that he relied on his staff and relied on a few other sources to cobble together bills, and wasn't necessarily doing it nefariously. And I think a lot of people had that surface level, like bullet point, this is what I want to do with my legislation. And then they sought out people that could help them get the text of it, which is fine if there are like pure intentions and that whoever you're pulling it from is genuine and aligns with what you want. We saw people lying to us. I mean, the most egregious examples of when we confronted people with actual copied legislation and they said, no, I wrote that myself, which very clearly was not the case. And then we saw people defending it, saying, I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to come up with completely unique ideas. Obviously, this shortcuts the system a little bit. And then there were those who were completely honest and said, yes, I worked with a industry lobbyist to write this bill because I agree with them, which is, obviously still happens. These are some of the groups we identified. It's not just ALEC, it's not just Goldwater. The National Consumer Law Center is a group that I work with a lot that, does a lot of consumer rights litigation and education, but they also present their models online. They want to protect consumers and put laws into place that'll do that. The insurance industry is really big into this. And then obviously Civil Liberties Institute for Justice, they try to get into that legalese and technical language that regular people might not ever interact with, but it can really impact their lives. Rob, you want to take this one?
So one of the questions is, why are Republicans more successful? And the answer is because Democratic groups often have a library of bills. So you can go to the library and you can pick out a bill, not very, it's useful, not very, sexy, not exciting. Republicans generally use model legislation as a lobby. GOP lawmakers are courted from the day they take office. They're taken to conferences, they build social bonds, they're sort of wined and dined, and they are provided research help for their bills. They get to know the top lawyers and fundraisers, which can help them tremendously in their campaign. And it's very low cost for lawmakers, and it's low cost for corporations too, as like some of our experts have pointed out. Some corporations pay $10,000 or $25,000 for this access. If you were paying a lobbyist to do a bill, to run a bill in one state, your tab would easily be double or triple that. So this is low cost for the lawmakers. They don't have to, they get taken, they get flown to these conferences, they get the meals paid for, they get all this research help. They get to go back to their state and say, look what I did. They get to sort of have something to run for re-election on. And it's cheap for the people that are lobbying them and doing the model bills as well. Sorry, this was just an example of a sidebar to the series, which is all about ALEC, and it has a lot of these ideas in it. ALEC is the most famous one. They did not have the most models. The most models was a group called the Council of State Governments, but they're famous for a reason, because they are sort of the poster child for doing this. And in this story, we lay out just exactly how it happens. We talked to ALEC, who said they have safeguards on the process and different stuff, but there's a lot of people who believe that those sort of guardrails are very limited. And just what the process is, what does it look like when you go to one of these conferences?
This asbestos case study is the one I spent my most time on reporting out this project. It's one of those really kind of niche and complicated pieces of legislation. There's a whole series of bills aimed at product liability and forced arbitration and asbestos and lead paint. And they all are aimed at reducing the litigation burden on these companies and reducing the insurance companies' risk exposure. So there's a whole bill about trust transparency. And what that meant was individual states had set up trusts to pay for people who had been harmed by asbestos in their communities, either working with it or installing it or removing it. And what the bill did was mandate that you only went through that trust and you could not go after the companies that were also responsible, including the insurance companies that were ultimately responsible. And while, on its face, it sounds like a good idea, trust transparency, we want to make sure everybody knows about this. That's not exactly what the impact was. And because this was so obscure and there are so relatively few experts about it, you had guys like this, Mark Barron's on the right, who was often presented at state legislative hearings as the expert in the country. He is the guy. But of course, he was on the payroll of the Chamber of Commerce and of the asbestos groups to write these bills and to shepherd them through the legislative process. So we saw him again and again and again lobbying / testifying at these hearings about why this is important, why it's not as bad as people would let you think, and it's simple, but obviously it had really big ramifications. This was just our contact. I want to make sure you guys have this, and a quick look at our process for this or any other project. We try to review all the literature, review what's been written about this kind of stuff. We weren't the first to write about model legislation. We did a ton of research about what had been done, who had been focused, how we could probably push it forward. We found the Sherpas to help us guide, through this system. There are also experts that had built algorithms like ours that could help check us, help us fix stuff as it broke. And then really step back and say, are we breaking new ground? Is this worth all this effort? And we ultimately decided in this case it was. And we're checking our hypotheses the whole way, saying this is what we expect to find through this, and then formulating how we're going to present it, and then ultimately reporting it. So it was a long process. These are Rob's contacts. So I think we're at that point for questions. These are some of the things that we had teed up that we think are really important. I mean, fundamentally, I think this comes down to, are these bad? And, it really is a matter of perspective, and our story and some of the editorials around it came down to the conclusion that, transparency and, full knowledge of who's writing them, how often are they introduced, who's backing them, is a totally different situation of these kind of backroom private conference rooms where you don't know who's funding it. You don't know why your legislator's on a plane to go do a special tour, and has access and all these gifts and kind of sweet deals. So to me, that's what really it fundamentally comes down to. So I'd love to hear what you guys think, and maybe we can answer some questions.
Well, Nick and Rob, thank you so much. And we do have some questions in the chat box. And so I think what I'll do, if this is okay, is I'll read that question, and then you guys can chime in. And the first question that came from a participant who wrote the question prior to the workshop, and I'll just read the question. We have known about the work of ALEC for decades now, yet there seems to be gaining more and more influence in state governments. ALEC has very deep pockets and is known to contribute millions to gain seats in the legislatures and on state regulatory agencies. Here in Arizona, I understand that more than 50% of the legislators and the governor's office are all closely aligned or members of ALEC. We know that ALEC agenda of no regulation for corporations, especially those in highly polluting extractive industries. Here's the question. What are states like ours doing to combat ALEC successfully? Are there any examples where the good guys actually win in these battles?
So, I mean, I think I can talk a little bit about Arizona. I mean, the question is absolutely on point. They do have more power, and I'll tell you what, with the pandemic had kind of, sort of altering, the life in our country, they have even more now this year than they've even had in previous years. There aren't a lot of states that have really combated this well. I mean, we worked on a couple of solution stories, like, where you'd have to have a law, you'd have to flag it for people that you had used a substantial portion of a model to create a bill. But the problem with that is since everybody does it, nobody wants to put those rules in, because then they're going to have to cop to it, every time they write a bill. And then when they run for re-election, some reporter is going to go read all the disclosures and then, write a story about how 72% of the bills that they passed were models. So that's really the difficulty in it. Is you have to want to you have to sort of want to self-regulate yourself, and most legislatures just don't do that. I mean, the other reason that they're powerful is they have money and they're committed to this. If you look at a group like that has successfully battled, ALEC and sort of this model legislation, is a group like Save Our Schools Arizona. And if you talk with them or talk about them to people, I mean, basically they signed up to do this for the rest of their lives. They're going to be fighting ALEC bills on education, for until the cows come home, at least probably until the legislature flipped the other way, and Democrats would control it. So there's not, I guess my perspective would be, sunlight's often the best disinfectant. So if we can figure out a way to, I mean, what we wanted to do and continue to want to do is to collect more of these models and run more of these things so we can out, the special interests. Legislatively, it's just a difficult thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the disclosure requirements, both on the lobbying activity as well as the drafting documents, is really key. And we saw it like in Iowa and here in Wisconsin, there are laws that those have to be public. And, one of the research pieces we did came across this email where a legislator was emailing his staff saying, I want this, put it in our language as written. And, that's as clear cut as possible as a legislator, saying, here's the model. I want it in our language. Please, do the bidding of this industry. And, seeing that in black and white as a reporter, or giving the public the tools to see that, is really powerful information. Even if it doesn't change any minds, I think it's really important to have that transparency.
Okay, here's the next question on the similar. Is there a way to see ALEC proposed bills without being a member of ALEC to get into the library, so to speak?
Well, a lot of these groups publish them, especially some of the public or the interest groups. So that's one way. I mean, the short-circuited way to do this is to look at Legiscan, which is a public repository of all introduced bills around the country, and you can do this search. You can create a profile and do this searching by keywords or by text string. And I just did this with a colleague the other day, researching Boy Scouts of America pushing a bill for access to high schools and middle schools. And they weren't using the language Boy Scouts, and that would have set off alarm bells. So they were using some keywords like patriotic organizations. And when I searched patriotic organizations, I got 6 results for 6 different states with the identical bill. And that's exactly what our project did. And you can do that if you have a niche topic or something you're really interested in. I mean, I'm sure if you went to Legiscan today and typed in Airbnb or short-term rental, you would see the latest scan. And there are groups that track ALEC. I mean, the Center for Media and Democracy, that's really their full-time gig. So maybe you connect with some of those voices, they can help flag some of that, and then that backstop with checking it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great options. I mean, if you're looking at ALEC specific, they put their bills online. So yeah, like we had to scrape and some of the old ones, and we got an insider who leaked us some of the old ones, but a lot of the new ones are simply online, and you can check them out. That we found, and I think Nick would agree with this, is the industries that are trying to influence are often more open than the politicians who are getting influenced. So they're perfectly willing to say, yes, we're going to do this, and we're bringing these people to the ALEC conference. The politicians who go to the ALEC conference and push the model bills often want to talk less than the actual special interest.
Yeah, we also, I mean, a lot of the industry groups are transparent about they view their models as skeletons, and they don't want legislators to take them verbatim. They think they need customization. And I think that's important too, is that, through this process, you did see some legislators saying, I liked this piece of language, but I didn't like that. And obviously this wouldn't fit our state and this wouldn't fit. And I think that's healthy as these kind of evolved and got better. It was that wholesale like copying stuff that even sometimes didn't make any sense for a state, that is really not so great.
Okay, here's another one. Do these model wordings or bills also make their way into proposed federal legislation? What is the impact of these organizations at the federal level?
Yeah, they do. It's just less. It happens less. And the reason it happens less is because, you know, to wine and dine a state legislator is much less expensive than a member of Congress. So
Yeah.
you can go ahead, Nick.
I was gonna say, we also heard the opposite, where people saw Congress as so log jammed and such a long shot to get legislation. They see this as their cheaper and more efficient option, is let's target 5 states and get our legislation passed, and it'll slowly be, pick up steam.
Yeah, so we also looked at Congress, and there were bills in Congress that were models. It was just an infinitely smaller percent. I mean, I highlighted the one, right to try, that got through Congress. But you know, like Nick said, it's so log jammed. There's, you have to spend so much money to move Congress, whereas you could spend, a 1/10 of 1% of that money and get it passed in 5 states, and then hope to do that again.
I think you also mentioned in your articles just the legislative logjam at the federal level, and some more efforts are being focused on state houses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, here's another question. It touches on a prior one. How can we identify model legislation, assuming there are quite a number dealing with reproductive rights? So Nick, you mentioned Legiscan. What else can you add?
Well, those groups, I think the groups that this is their passion project are good to keep in touch with. They're tracking some of these efforts. I remember, there's this wave of bills about hospital admitting requirements and hallway design. And obviously those are abortion aimed bills, and the groups that are pro-choice and really focused on that have their antennas up, and they know exactly what a state's trying to do when it does that. So that's the best. That's what we look to when we're trying to, flag some of these. If it doesn't catch an algorithm, is we'll watch the groups that are really keeping a really close eye on it. The NCLC, the state legislative group is good at that too. They keep an eye on trends of states picking up things, and this year they're focused on voter rights and bills that are focused on either limiting hours or changing the absentee balloting systems. So there are groups that do this same tracking, but really more to the granular topic level.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would also look at the people who are doing it. They're especially for abortion and reproductive rights. There are several groups that are like the primary people that are pushing it. If you remember, a couple years ago, right after the story came out, there was a series of heartbeat bills. It was a bills that, where you couldn't have an abortion if there was a heartbeat, and they popped up all over the South. And it was a model that came from the Heartland Institute, and they had essentially copied it. So I would look both, like what Nick said, look to the opponents, but then also study what the people who are trying to push this are doing. And if you look at both, you can find a lot.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. Could we get an Arizona town hall involved in doing a program on this whole topic? They are not political, but all this info needs to be known to more people. How can we spread the word?
Yeah, you don't convince us. We're always for more of that. I think it's getting people engaged and to understand. Obviously, I think we all believe that this legislation is so much more impactful oftentimes than the federal legislation, and people aren't quite as engaged.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to talk to the Arizona Town Hall. They obviously share our story. We need to keep on this as well. And we had sort of touched on this along the way with the presentation, but one of the reasons this is successful is because some of the language that goes through the legislatures is they're insanely arcane and hard to understand. And so it's difficult for people to get upset about an asbestos transparency bill, right? Because it's about, is it showing where you can get money for asbestos? No, it's saying sick people cannot sue the companies that are, that got them sick. And so that's one of the sort of the things that stops this from being, more widespread, is that you have this arcane language that people don't understand, even though it's so impactful. Because people can't understand it, you don't have that sort of, howling outrage about it.
And here's another question, and it refers to your questions. It's number 5 on citizen legislators. And the person asks, what is a citizen legislator?
Well, this is interesting that I think a lot of states operate this way where they're not full-time. You think about South Dakota, they meet every 2 years. There are a lot of legislators that are part-time, they're executives themselves, or they're running their small business, and that's one of their crutches that they say, I didn't have time to look into the whole background of this. It came into my email. I thought it was a good idea, or I went to a conference, I saw it, I asked for a copy of it, and now it's a law in my state. So one of the solutions I think a lot of people suggested is maybe these legislators should be spending more time on this, and you shouldn't have part-time people controlling the future of your state. Is that it does take attention and resources and time, and you should be committed to it.
And it's sort of the next bullet ties into it. You get this sort of good government thing. Well, if we make them full-time, we'll get less model legislation because they're going to write the bills because they'll be full-time working on this. They won't also be a dentist or a real estate agent or whatever. But one of the problems we found with that is we didn't find a connection between like part-time legislatures and full-time. New York is a full-time legislature. Their legislators are full-time, and they had some of the highest number of model bills. So obviously Mississippi has some of the lowest pay and is big part-time. They had some of the most, but there wasn't like a 1-for-1 tie. A 1-for-1 tie into this, and this was one of the things Nick talked about. You test your theories as you see the data and you see the reporting, and we just didn't. We thought we would find this, and we just did not. It really, some of the top states were full-time, some of the top states were part-time. I just think it goes to the fact that there's so many special interests, and people don't run for politics for the same reasons they did 30-40 years ago. Why would you run for the Arizona legislature and make $24,000 a year? And the answer is most likely because there's some other reason you want to get involved than just the salary and to be there. Because sometimes it's punishing. I mean, some of these hearings can last. I mean, the hearing I'm going to get on after this call might last until 9 o'clock. So it's not like who wants that job. And then the thing you run up against in fixing it is everybody sees the job that their legislature or their city council does. And somebody comes in with a plan to pay them more money, and they say, look at the job they do. We don't want to pay them more money. And so you run up against that as well when you try to fix it.
Okay, I skipped a question, so let's go back and maybe you can help us with this one. Is ALEC or any other group behind the Article 5 convention legislation? And maybe you could tell us what Article 5 is for those who don't know about it.
Yeah, so there's several. These got written about in our story. There's several attempts to amend the Constitution, and so there's several ways you can amend the Constitution. You can, but you need 3/4 of the states. And so what these ALEC bills want to do is to get enough of the state legislatures to pass these these Article 5 or Article, there's a number of them. So they can have a constitutional convention, to discuss this. And, if you ever did that, if you want to talk about like special interest money going wild, I mean, imagine instead of trying to, buy off the legislature, or the Congress, which for 2 years, imagine you could get something inserted into the Constitution and have it be forever. And that's sort of the appeal of this. And so you have, they're usually right-wing states. I mean, it's almost always right-wing states. You have a number of them pass these same Article 5 or whatever article they are. And if you get enough of them, you can call a constitutional convention. So what happens is like, some states that are sort of, more in the middle, like Maryland, they'll pass it. And then when they start getting up to the level you can call a constitutional convention, they'll repeal it. So like they're sort of like perpetually at, 4 or 5 states below the number of states that they need. But we talked to some legal scholars who said, like, basically, if you were able to do this, this is when like it gets really scary, because like I said, imagine the money that would be funneled in if you're changing the Constitution permanently versus, who controls the House for 2 years. And so it, ALEC, a lot of those bills are ALEC bills.
Okay, that is our questions in chat, and we still have some time, and I imagine we still have some questions. And so if it's okay with you guys, why don't we open it up to questions from participants, our audience? And if you just raise your hand, either I or Mary Ann will recognize you, and then you can unmute yourself, and then please ask your question. Let's see. Do we have any questions?
I'm not seeing any hands up in the participant panel, Robin.
Okay. Well, then, Rob, Odell, and Nick Penzenstadler, we want to thank you very much for spending time with us and doing this important work. We may be calling on you with the Arizona Convention to spread the word more, but we really appreciate your time. And on behalf of the League, thank you very much, and thank everybody who participated today.
Guys, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. I'm going to end the program now for everyone.
I really appreciate